This video is a brief overview of kernels and samples when working with Octane for Cinema 4D. And for this video, I'm using the limo 01.c4d scene. Very simple scene with a couple characters and a spaceship, space limousine, and some spaceport geo in the background. So kernels and samples are probably two of the most important aspects of working with Octane for Cinema 4D because they determine how the light is calculated as it's interacting and reflecting off of surfaces, as well as the overall quality and reduction of noise in the scene. So if I'm in the live viewer, I'll click on this little gear icon right here to open up the Octane settings. And by default, it's opened up to the kernels tab where I can choose my kernel. So I have several different kernels to choose from. We have direct lighting, which is not necessarily physically accurate, but is very nice looking and fast way to render a scene. But it doesn't always render things like refractions correctly. So you can see we can no longer see through the shield of this particular space helmet. It will allow transparency, but in some situations it's not as physically accurate, probably because there's a lot of shadows within the helmet here, so light is not getting through and bouncing around and coming out correctly. But you can get a very nice looking render with direct lighting, and it is faster. A lot of users will start setting up their scene and test it using direct lighting, and then when you get into a situation where you need more physical accuracy in your render, you can switch then to path tracing. So path tracing is a little bit slower but more physically accurate, and you can see now the light is getting through the transparent shield, bouncing around and coming out again, so we can see our happy little alien inside. All right, he's not all that happy, but we can still see his face. So path tracing is probably the most common kernel to use when rendering with Octane for Cinema 4D. And then, of course, you also have PMC, which is the most physically accurate. In this particular scene, probably won't see much of a difference. You see it's a little bit slower, though. It takes a while to resolve some of that noise. But if you're working in a scene where you have a lot of caustic light patterns, as light goes through refractive surfaces or, say, is reflected off of reflective materials onto diffuse materials, and you kind of see those little reflection caustic highlights. PMC will give you the most accurate solution for caustics. So it's the most physically accurate, but also the slowest of the three rendering kernels. The fourth rendering kernel that we have is the Info Channels kernel, and it is meant as a diagnostic tool. So we can set this to, say, ambient occlusion or normal, shading normals, wireframe, and so on. So it's a diagnostic kernel, not really meant for photorealistic renders. So let's switch back to path tracing here. Now, once you choose your render kernel, of course, then you're going to go into the settings and fine-tune the settings to get the optimal render. And you're basically balancing out render time with a reduction in render noise. That's sort of the goal here. So these settings will allow you to do that, and we have many videos that go into these settings more in depth. In fact, we have a video devoted to each render kernel that you see in this menu here. But I just want to do a quick overview before we get into the weeds on that. The next most important setting, of course, is the maximum samples. So the way that Octane works is once you start a render with Octane for Cinema 4D, it's going to continue to calculate. You can see this little green bar here will continue to grow until it reaches that max sample setting. So this max sample is going to be different depending on the scene that you're rendering. So it's different depending on the type of lighting you've chosen, the materials, the amount of geometry in the scene, and your desired result. So you want to set this to the lowest possible setting achievable, the lowest possible setting that will get you the least amount of noise in the render. So 16,000 for this scene is probably way too high. We could probably get away with something like 1,000 or maybe even less. But once it starts rendering, it's going to keep rendering until it hits that 1,000 mark. So if I change the view, you can see it's going to start calculating again and keep rendering until it reaches that 1,000 sample mark. Now, when you're doing testing, you know, it's not really a big deal if you set that too high. It just means it's going to keep calculating. But if you're doing like a batch render, you want to be careful about the setting, because if you set it too high, then each frame in the batch render is going to continue calculating and continue rendering until it hits that setting. So if I set this for 10,000 when I only need like 500, then every frame of the batch render is going to render until it hits 10,000, even though it doesn't need to. So make sure you set this correctly. So that's the basics of working with render kernels and samples in Octane for Cinema 4D. And as I mentioned before, we have movies that will get into more detail about the settings that you see here for each of the render kernels.